In early 2026, a small landlocked nation in West Africa did something most governments never dare to do. It openly admitted its development pace still resembled the 18th century. Instead of hiding behind optimistic statistics or polished slogans, the leadership chose pressure over comfort, deadlines over excuses, and the real risk of failure over the safety of delay. Why should this matter to an American audience? And why does this moment revolve around Ibrahim Traoré rather than abstract development theory? Because once time itself becomes a political weapon, hesitation stops being neutral and starts becoming dangerous. You are about to hear an explanation that carries real weight. Not because it flatters or reassures, but because it strips away the comfortable version of this story. By the end of this section, you will understand why this moment is not about rhetoric or symbolism, but about how power, urgency, and responsibility are being redefined in real time. This is not content designed for passive listening. If you stop here, you are left with a surface narrative shaped by headlines and repetition rather than structure and consequence. You risk mistaking bold language for empty posturing or dismissing a serious gamble as political theater. You also miss why this admission changes how every later decision must be judged, not only inside Burkina Faso, but by partners, critics, and observers abroad. What follows matters because it explains what is actually at stake, not abstract growth targets, not ideological positioning, but the price of compressing decades of delay into a few decisive years. Once a state names its weakness publicly, it can no longer hide behind ambiguity. Every delay becomes visible, and every failure carries a higher cost. Understanding this is the difference between watching events unfold and recognizing why they cannot easily be reversed. What makes this moment different is not the ambition itself, but what was revealed once the language shifted from aspiration to admission. When a government publicly states that it is operating centuries behind modern economies, it is not signaling weakness for sympathy, it is removing its own escape routes. One simple comparison captures the scale. Instead of measuring progress against regional peers, Burkina Faso placed itself against the industrial timeline of history and accepted the gap openly. That single move reframed everything that followed. The problem did not begin in 2026, but the consequences of naming it did. Slow administration, borrowed models, and extended timelines had been treated as unfortunate but manageable realities. Those habits became liabilities rather than norms. The admission forced institutions, officials, and citizens to confront a shared baseline that could no longer be debated away. This is where Ibrahim Traoré enters the story in a way that changes its meaning. Rather than presenting the delay as an inherited burden or an external injustice, he framed it as a starting line. Pretending to be closer to modernity than reality allows is a form of self-sabotage. Problems that remain unnamed are problems that never get solved. The seriousness of this shift becomes clear when looking at who feels the impact first. Bureaucracies accustomed to caution suddenly face deadlines instead of open-ended plans. Citizens accustomed to promises demand for effort rather than comfort. The psychological contract between state and population changes when honesty replaces reassurance. People are no longer treated as spectators waiting for results, but as participants whose actions matter. This context explains why the decision resonated beyond Burkina Faso. Leaders are trained to project progress even when reality contradicts it. Openly acknowledging delay is often seen as inviting ridicule or pressure. Yet the opposite risk is greater. Denial locks a country into repetition. By choosing clarity over comfort, the country crossed a threshold where hesitation itself became the danger, and where every next step would be judged against a truth already spoken aloud. At this stage of the story, the focus shifts from the admission itself to the figure guiding how that admission is meant to be interpreted and acted upon. Ibrahim Traoré does not appear here as a distant symbol or a rhetorical presence, but as a reference point through which urgency is translated into direction. But to make it operational, to turn a diagnosis into a demand that institutions can no longer postpone. One early impact of this approach appeared inside the state apparatus itself. Administrations long accustomed to cautious pacing suddenly faced a different standard of evaluation. Delay was no longer neutral behavior. It became a visible failure to respond to a declared emergency of time. Officials were not asked to explain constraints, but to demonstrate execution. That shift altered incentives quickly, not because capacity instantly increased, but because tolerance for inertia collapsed. A second impact emerged in how citizens interpreted the message. Instead of being positioned as passive recipients of development plans, people were addressed as adults capable of absorbing uncomfortable truths. The promise offered was not comfort, but dignity earned through effort. This distinction mattered. It reduced the gap between leadership and population by replacing spectacle with shared pressure. What makes this guidance distinctive is that it does not rely on charisma or dramatic gestures. It relies on consistency. Ibrahim Traoré places himself inside the same constraints he imposes on the system, tying his legitimacy to outcomes rather than intentions. That choice narrows his room for maneuver, but it also clarifies the stakes for everyone involved. From that point forward, the question was no longer whether change was necessary. The question became whether the system could endure the strain of moving faster than it ever had before. The shift from diagnosis to motion happened quickly, and once it began, it did not unfold gently. First came the trigger. The language of patience disappeared. Deadlines replaced timelines. Acceleration stopped being an aspiration and became an order. In practical terms, this meant that routines which had survived for years were suddenly exposed. Administrative processes that once stretched without consequence were now measured against a fixed year. Priorities narrowed. Decisions that had been delayed for safety were pushed forward under pressure, especially inside institutions built to move slowly by design. Then came the climb toward a visible climax. Pressure multiplied rather than stabilized. Ministries were expected to act before conditions felt comfortable. Public enterprises faced scrutiny not for intentions, but for outputs. Regional administrations discovered that waiting for instructions was no longer acceptable behavior. The rhythm of governance accelerated, and with it came friction, errors, and fatigue. At the same time, reaction spread beyond the state. Citizens began to sense that this was not another cycle of announcements. The message was consistent and repeated without dilution. Effort was framed as unavoidable, not optional. Sacrifice was presented as temporary but necessary, but unmistakable. Some responded with cautious engagement, others with skepticism, few remained indifferent. The aftershocks revealed themselves gradually. Systems under sustained pressure expose weaknesses faster than they fix them. Mistakes surfaced. But something else changed as well. Excuses lost credibility. When deadlines are real, explanations feel thinner. What could not be done quickly was at least identified clearly, and what could be done was expected immediately. This sequence explains why the acceleration carried both momentum and risk. Moving faster did not guarantee success. It guaranteed exposure. Processes that survived on delay could no longer hide. Structures that depended on borrowed time were forced to adapt or fail. The country entered a phase where stability was no longer maintained by slowing down, but by pushing through uncertainty. For Ibrahim Traoré, this was not an unintended consequence, it was the mechanism itself. Acceleration was designed to surface limits early rather than conceal them indefinitely. Whether that gamble strengthens the system or exhausts it depends on what follows, not on the decision to move faster. Before looking at motives or ideology, it helps to slow down and examine the hard signals that explain why this strategy feels heavier than ordinary reform language. This is the point where emotion gives way to measurement, not to overwhelm with statistics, but to anchor the scale of what is being attempted. Once acceleration is declared, numbers stop being decoration and start becoming constraints. The first indicator is the baseline itself. Burkina Faso is not measuring progress against last year or even against its neighbors, but against an industrial timeline that spans centuries. Describing the national rhythm as closer to the 18th century is not a metaphor of style, it is a declaration of distance. It signals that incremental gains of a few percentage points or isolated projects cannot close the gap. The baseline is so far back that speed becomes non-negotiable. The second indicator is time compression. The year 2026 is treated not as a target range, but as a hinge. That framing matters. A hinge year implies before and after, not gradual adjustment. Decades of delayed opportunity are being compressed into a small number of intense years. This compression increases risk mathematically. When timelines shrink, error rates rise, coordination becomes harder, and fatigue accumulates faster than capacity. The third indicator is institutional load. Public company and regional administration is now operating under a shared deadline rather than separate planning cycles. That alignment changes behavior. Tasks that once competed for attention are forced into hierarchy. Some priorities advance quickly. Others are dropped entirely. The system sheds weight not through careful optimization, but through pressure. What survives does so because it can move. There is also a human metric embedded in this shift. Citizens are no longer promised comfort while waiting for progress. That alters the psychological equation. When pressure is acknowledged openly, disappointment is less explosive, but exhaustion becomes a real risk. The strategy assumes that dignity gained through effort can offset the strain of acceleration. That assumption will be tested repeatedly. Viewed together, these indicators explain why this moment cannot be treated as ordinary development rhetoric. The baseline is deep, the timeline is narrow, and the load is heavy. Each factor alone would be challenging. Combined, they create a situation where delay compounds damage faster than mistakes do. This is the logic behind the gamble associated with Ibrahim Traoré. Fixing time and applying pressure internally, the country is trading the safety of slow decline for the danger of fast struggle. But they are clarifying. They explain why standing still is no longer presented as neutral and why every month now carries visible weight. At this point, it is necessary to pause and take seriously the strongest arguments raised against this strategy, not to dismiss them, but to understand why they sound convincing to many observers. Reasonable people look at accelerated timelines and see danger rather than discipline. They argue that moving too fast in a fragile system risks breaking what little capacity already exists, turning pressure into collapse instead of progress. One major criticism focuses on institutional exhaustion. Bureaucracies in low-capacity states are slow, not because they lack ambition, but because they are already overstretched. Compressing decades into a few years can multiply errors, overwhelm coordination, and burn out the very people expected to implement change. Speed, critics say, rewards shortcuts and punishes reflection. In this reading, caution is not laziness but survival. When reforms fail under pressure, the damage can set a country back further than gradual improvement ever would. A second argument centers on social stability. Sustained pressure, especially when paired with uncertainty, can erode public trust rather than strengthen it. Citizens may initially accept sacrifice, but fatigue accumulates unevenly. Those with fewer resources feel strain first. Frustration can harden into disengagement or resistance. From this perspective, dignity promised through effort risks turning into disappointment delivered through delay, especially when outcomes remain abstract while costs are immediate. These critiques deserve attention because they reflect real historical failures. Many rapid modernization attempts collapsed under their own weight. Ambition outpaced capacity. Pressure produced spectacle, not results. Ignoring these lessons would be reckless. Yet this is where the counterpoint matters. The argument for acceleration is not that speed is safe, but that slowness is quietly dangerous. Systems that move too slowly do not preserve capacity, they allow decay to become normalized. External dependence deepens, young talent exits. Ibrahim Traoré's approach implicitly accepts the risks highlighted by critics, but reframes the comparison. The choice is not between safe gradualism and reckless speed. It is between slow erosion with limited visibility and fast strain with clear feedback. Pressure exposes weaknesses quickly, but it also prevents them from lingering unnoticed for decades. Errors surface early when correction is still possible. The deeper tension, then, is not about whether acceleration is risky. One path spreads damage quietly over time, the other concentrates it visibly in the present. Understanding this trade-off does not settle the debate, but it clarifies why the strategy cannot be judged by comfort alone. It must be judged by whether exposure today is preferable to stagnation tomorrow. And then, the story turns. What alters the trajectory here is not another announcement, but a reframing that changes how every previous element is understood. The acceleration is not primarily about growth rates, infrastructure, or even reform sequencing. It is about sovereignty over time. Once that becomes clear, earlier choices stop looking reactive and start appearing coherent. The midpoint reveal lies in how pressure is defined. Pressure arrives from the outside. It comes through owners, credit ratings, conditional loans, or external benchmarks. In this case, pressure is generated internally and deliberately. It is pushing itself. That reversal matters more than any single policy decision because it changes who controls the tempo. This shift explains why certain options were rejected outright. Even when financially attractive, were treated as constraints on future decision-making rather than solutions. External timelines were seen as incompatible with internal urgency. The emphasis moved from asking how the world would judge progress to asking how much strain the system could endure without losing control of its direction. Once seen through this lens, acceleration stops being a race to impress and becomes a test of autonomy. Speed is not pursued to look modern. It is pursued to avoid being governed by delay imposed from elsewhere. Time itself becomes the terrain of competition. Those who control it shape outcomes, those who surrender it inherit them. This reframing also alters how success and failure are measured. Partial progress no longer provides cover. Missed deadlines are not softened by rhetoric. At the same time, mistakes made under self-imposed pressure are treated differently from failures caused by external dependence. The former are considered costly but instructive. The latter are viewed as compounding weakness. From here on, the story is no longer about whether acceleration is bold. It is about whether reclaiming control over time can offset the strain it inevitably creates. That question opens the second half of the narrative, where consequences move from theory into lived reality. From this point forward, the effects are no longer abstract. They move out of speeches and timelines and into daily reality, where consequences become visible and unevenly distributed. Markets, households, and relationships beyond national borders. For the state, the pressure reshapes governance first. Decision windows narrow. Policies that once waited for consensus move under executive urgency. But it also concentrates responsibility. When time is scarce, ambiguity is punished. Failure erodes it quickly. The state no longer has the luxury of blaming delay on inherited constraints. Every outcome is tied to choices made under a declared deadline. For businesses, the shift introduces volatility. Domestic firms face both opportunity and strain as priorities are reordered. Some sectors benefit from faster approvals and clearer direction. Others struggle with compressed compliance and financing timelines. Uncertainty raises costs, but it also discourages passive speculation. Investment decisions become more selective. Speed over positioning. For ordinary citizens, the impact is more personal. Employment expectations and public services asked to do more with limited buffers. The appeal to dignity through effort resonates unevenly. Those with skills aligned to accelerated sectors see opportunity. Those without feel the strain first. The social contract changes tone. Patience is no longer rewarded. Beyond the country's borders, the regional effect begins to register. Neighbors watch closely not because the model is easily transferable, but because it challenges familiar assumptions. External partners recalibrate, some grow cautious. The signal sent is not isolation, but renegotiation on tighter timelines. Taken together, these consequences reveal the real weight of the strategy. No group stands entirely outside it. Benefits and costs arrive together and quickly. Acceleration clarifies winners and losers sooner than gradualism ever does. That clarity can stabilize expectations or it can harden divisions depending on what follows. This is why the story cannot be reduced to ambition alone. Once time is weaponized, its effects ripple through every layer of society and beyond. The question is no longer whether the pressure is real, and what adjustments will determine who breaks first. The most likely path forward is neither dramatic success nor immediate failure, but a tense middle ground shaped by uneven execution. Acceleration continues, but friction becomes routine rather than exceptional. Some institutions adapt to pressure and improve delivery. Progress appears visible in specific sectors, while gaps persist elsewhere. Stability holds, not because strain disappears, but because expectations adjust to a faster, harsher rhythm. The country moves forward, though without the clean breakthrough implied by the original ambition. A more optimistic scenario depends on alignment rather than speed alone. In this version, internal coordination improves faster than anticipated. Early mistakes produce learning rather than paralysis. Capacity builds through repetition, and confidence compounds. Citizens begin to see tangible outcomes that justify the effort demanded of them, recognizing that internal pressure is producing results. Under these conditions, acceleration becomes self-reinforcing, and urgency turns into competence. The gamble does not eliminate hardship, but it converts strain into durable capability. The worst-case scenario emerges if pressure outpaces resilience. Here, fatigue accumulates faster than results. Errors multiply without correction. Institutions absorb stress but fail to adapt structurally. Public patience thins as costs remain immediate while benefits stay abstract. In this environment, urgency loses legitimacy and begins to resemble coercion. Once framed as a path to dignity, risks being interpreted as mismanagement. External actors exploit the strain, and internal cohesion weakens. The system does not collapse overnight, but it enters a cycle of reactive fixes that undermine the original intent. What matters across all three scenarios is not prediction, but preparation. Each outcome hinges on how pressure is managed rather than whether it exists. Acceleration magnifies both competence and weakness. And feedback? It punishes denial and fragmentation. The future does not depend on choosing the correct narrative, but on maintaining the ability to adjust under stress. This is where leadership choices remain decisive. Ibrahim Traoré's strategy creates a narrow corridor where learning must outpace exhaustion. The margin for error is real, but so is the cost of retreat. Whether the path stabilizes, strengthens, or fractures will depend on how pressure is translated into structure rather than symbolism. After following the arc of decisions, pressure, and possible futures, the most important question narrows sharply. The person listening beyond analysis and headlines, understanding the structure of this moment, changes how you interpret not just one country's choices, but how power, time, and responsibility interact more broadly. If you are someone who actively follows global affairs, this story offers a practical lens. You gain an advantage by recognizing how internally generated pressure differs from externally imposed reform. It helps you separate symbolic acceleration from structural change. That awareness matters when judging whether bold language is backed by mechanisms that can sustain it, rather than rhetoric, becomes the key skill. If you are affected indirectly through economic ties, security concerns, or regional stability, the relevance is quieter but real. Accelerated strategies tend to produce volatility before they produce clarity. Migration patterns or diplomatic alignments faster than expected. Being prepared means adjusting expectations early, not reacting late, and recognizing that rapid change rarely sends polite advance notice. If you have mostly viewed this as distant or unrelated, that distance can be misleading. Moments like this illustrate how quickly assumptions about development, dependency, and pace can shift. When time becomes a strategic resource, changes propagate outward. Ignoring them does not preserve stability, it delays understanding. By the time effects feel personal, options are often narrower. Across all three positions, the common thread is agency. You are not required to agree with the strategy, but understanding it protects you from being surprised by its consequences. But it does demand attention. In a world where acceleration is increasingly used as a tool, recognizing its signs early is itself a form of preparedness. Solutions cannot remain slogans at this stage, because pressure without direction only multiplies damage. Once acceleration is declared, the response has to be structured, sequenced, and measurable. Otherwise, urgency turns into noise. This is where the strategy either stabilizes or begins to fracture. At the center, leadership bears the first responsibility. The role of Ibrahim Traoré is not to push faster indefinitely, but to decide where pressure must be concentrated and where it must be relieved. That means setting a small number of priorities that are non-negotiable within the fixed timeline, and publicly measuring progress against them. Success here is not defined by ambition, but by visible execution and the willingness to correct course quickly when targets are missed. The second layer involves institutions and enterprises tasked with delivery. They must translate urgency into routines that can survive repetition. That requires clearer chains of responsibility, shorter feedback loops, and permission to stop projects that cannot move at speed. Measurement matters more than messaging. Progress is counted in outputs completed, not plans announced. Stability improves when effort is directed toward what can realistically scale under pressure. The third layer rests with citizens and communities. The demand placed on them must be matched with transparency. People can endure strain longer when they understand its purpose and limits. Small, concrete actions matter here. Participation is not about sacrifice alone, but about seeing how individual effort connects to collective outcomes. Trust grows when effort produces visible change, even if that change is modest. Beyond national borders, cooperation has to shift from dependency to alignment. Partnerships work only when timelines respect internal priorities rather than override them. External support that accelerates capacity strengthens autonomy. What ties these layers together is execution. Pressure creates opportunity only when it is channeled deliberately. Without that discipline, acceleration collapses into exhaustion. Strain becomes a temporary cost rather than a permanent condition. There is a moment earlier in the story that now deserves to be revisited quietly. It was not a speech filled with promise, nor a dramatic announcement meant to impress. It was the simple act of naming reality without protection and standing inside that truth rather than stepping around it. That gesture set the tone for everything that followed. From that starting point, the path unfolded through pressure, resistance, learning, and uncertainty. You have moved through the admission, the acceleration, the strain, and the possible futures. What once looked like a single decision now appears as a long chain of consequences that required endurance from institutions and people alike. The journey itself has weight, because it exposes how quickly clarity can replace illusion when time is no longer treated as endless. At the center of this arc stands Ibrahim Traoré. Not as a figure of spectacle, but as a symbol of a choice many leaders avoid. The choice to trade comfort for accountability. But more stable than reassurance delivered without results. That choice does not guarantee success. It guarantees responsibility. What lingers after all the analysis is not a policy debate, but a human question. How much pressure can a society absorb when it believes the direction is its own? This story is not ultimately about development metrics or timelines. It is about whether confronting reality early creates more room to act, or simply brings consequences forward in time. The decision has already been made, and it cannot be taken back. From here on, the weight of the future rests on follow-through, not intention. As this story reaches its final turn, it is worth slowing down rather than rushing to judgment. What you have just followed is not an argument demanding agreement, but a sequence inviting reflection. Different listeners will carry different reactions, shaped by their own experiences with pressure, risk, and responsibility. If this analysis helped you see the situation more clearly, consider whether others around you might benefit from the same clarity. But to give them the tools to think beyond headlines and quick reactions, shared understanding has value and choices carry long shadows. This is also an open conversation, not a closed conclusion. The questions raised here do not belong to one country alone. They touch on how societies respond when time becomes scarce, when honesty replaces reassurance, and when effort is demanded without guarantees. Those questions are increasingly common even if they appear in different forms. If you choose to engage, the most meaningful contribution is thoughtful discussion. What do you see as the real risk in moving too fast? And what do you see as the deeper danger in moving too slowly? There is no single correct answer, only perspectives sharpened by attention. Wherever you land, staying curious and informed keeps you from being surprised by change. And in moments defined by acceleration, that awareness is often the quiet difference between reacting late and understanding early.